I am the Decay Echo, and this is your invitation to witness the unfolding of a narrative that refuses to fade into the silence of oblivion, a narrative as eternal as the whispers of decay. Let the journey begin, and may your curiosity be as relentless as the march of time. Now, traveler, let's venture onward to discover myths, legends, facts, and forgotten history.
The ones who were never caught. Are they still watching? The case files are closed. The trails have gone cold. The crimes left behind, shattered bodies, stolen lives, remain unsolved. But the killers never left. They could be anywhere. A stranger in the crowd. A voice on the phone. Someone watching, waiting, unseen but never truly gone. History whispers that they disappeared. That time swallowed them whole. But time doesn't erase monsters. It lets them evolve. It lets them hide. Maybe they never stopped. Maybe they're still here. Listening. Look who's hopping over there by that bridge. It's the Bunny Man. Run. Fairfax County Public Library historian archivist Brian A. Conley extensively researched the Bunny Man legend. He has located 2 incidents of a man in a rabbit costume threatening people with an axe. The vandalism reports occurred 10 days apart in 1970 in Burke, Virginia. The first incident was reported on the evening of October 19, 1970, by U.S. Air Force Academy cadet Robert Bennett and his fiancée, who were visiting relatives on Guinea Road in Burke. Around midnight, while returning from a football game, they reportedly parked their car in a field on Guinea Road to visit an uncle who lived across the street from where the car was parked. As they sat in the front seat with the motor running, they noticed something moving outside the rear window. Moments later, the front passenger window was smashed, and there was a white-clad figure standing near the broken window. Bennett turned the car around while the man screamed at them about trespassing, saying, "You're on private property, and I have your tag number." As they drove down the road, the couple discovered a hatchet on the car floor. When the police requested a description of the man, Bennett insisted he was wearing a white suit with long bunny ears. However, Bennett's fiancée contested their assailant did not have bunny ears on his head, but was wearing a white cappirate of some sort. They both remembered seeing his face clearly, but in the darkness, they could not determine his race. The police returned the hatchet to Bennett after examination. The second reported sighting occurred on the evening of October 29, 1970, when construction security guard Paul Phillips approached a man standing on the porch of an unfinished home in Kings Park West on Guinea Road. Phillips said the man was wearing a gray, black, and white bunny costume, and was about 20 years old, 5 feet 8 inches, 1.73 meters, tall, and weighed about 175 pounds, 79 kilograms. The man began chopping at a porch post with a long-handled axe, saying, "You're trespassing. If you come any closer, I'll chop off your head." The Fairfax County Police opened investigations into both incidents, but both were eventually closed for lack of evidence. In the weeks following the incidents, more than 50 people contacted the police claiming to have seen the Bunny Man. Several newspapers, including the Washington Post, reported that the Bunny Man had eaten a man's runaway cat. In 1973, Patricia Johnson, a student at the University of Maryland, College Park, submitted a research paper that chronicled precisely 54 variations on the 2 incidents. Many maintain the basic plot in some shape or form, but vary in details like location and specific events. A handful even mention the Bunny Man committing murders, a detail at odds with the 2 documented sightings. Conley cites this as evidence of how the original Bunny Man story had mutated through various retellings, and that the story would be taken to new heights during the early days of the Internet. Conley further stated that the most widely circulated version of the story was posted to the website Castle of Spirits in 1999. In it, user Timothy J. Forbes claimed the Bunny Man was a convict named Douglas J. Griffin, who escaped to a railroad overpass while being transported to a new facility by bus in 1904. The story proceeds to chronicle a series of grisly, almost supernatural murders committed at Bunny Man Bridge, most occurring decades before the officially documented sightings. According to Conley, all of the specifics given in the Forbes version are false. Not only did the stated murders never happen, but key institutions mentioned, such as the Old Clifton Library, allegedly the source of the author's information, never existed in the first place. Meet the Doodler. In the neon shadows of 1970s San Francisco, a spectral killer emerged, one who turned horror into art. Known as the Doodler, his chilling sketches were preludes to violent ends, leaving behind cryptic clues and blood-stained canvases that continue to haunt the city. Tonight, we delve into his macabre legacy, a ghostly figure whose twisted artistry remains unsolved, lingering as a dark testament to a time when terror wore the guise of creativity. The Doodler is an unidentified serial killer believed responsible for between 6 and 16 murders and 3 assaults of men in San Francisco, California, United States, between January 1974 and September 1975. The nickname was given due to the perpetrator's habit of sketching his victims prior to stabbing them to death. The perpetrator met his victims at gay nightclubs, bars, and restaurants. The suspect was described as a black man between 19 and 25 years of age. He was about 6 feet tall with a slender build. Several victims were stabbed in the front and back of their bodies in similar locations. All of the victims were white males. Police theorized that the victims had all died after meeting with the suspect near the locations where their bodies were recovered. Here are just a few of the confirmed people killed that are linked directly to the Doodler. At 1:57 a.m. on January 27, 1974, a corpse was found at the water's edge on San Francisco's Ocean Beach. Gerald Earl Kavanaugh, 49, a Canadian-American immigrant, had been stabbed multiple times. Kavanaugh's fully clothed body was located lying face up. He had died hours before. He was determined to have been conscious at the time he was killed and had attempted to resist his killer because he had self-defense wounds. He initially remained unidentified, being temporarily known as John Doe No. 7 by the medical examiner. Joseph J. Stevens, 27, was discovered on June 25, 1974, by a woman walking along Spreckles Lake in San Francisco. Stevens had died shortly before his body was found. He had been seen at a club the previous day. He was employed as a female impersonator and comedian. Officers suspected that Stevens was alive at the time he had been at Spreckles Lake, possibly transporting himself to the area with the killer. Klaus Achim Klaus Christmann, 31, a German-American immigrant, was discovered by a woman walking her dog on July 7, 1974. He was found similarly to Gerald Kavanaugh, at Ocean Beach in San Francisco. His death had been somewhat more violent than the previous murders because he had considerably more stab wounds than Stevens and had been slashed in the throat several times. The body was fully clothed. Christmann, unlike the previous victims, was married and had children. The fact that he had a makeup tube on his person when he died suggested to police he may have been a closeted gay man. He remained unidentified briefly while police were investigating the cases, which they had believed were related after the third murder. In January 2022, the San Francisco police identified another victim. 52-year-old Warren Andrews, a lawyer for the U.S. Postal Service, was found in Land's End on April 27, 1975. Andrews was found unconscious but never regained consciousness, dying 7 weeks later. Andrews was beaten to death with a rock and a tree branch. Land's End is located just north of Ocean Beach, where 4 of the other victims' bodies were found. Frederick Elmer Kappen, 32, was discovered on May 12, 1975, in San Francisco. He had been stabbed like the other victims, dying from strikes to his aorta. It is believed his body had been moved approximately 20 feet as disturbances in the nearby sand indicated. Kappen was identified through fingerprints when these were matched to those taken by the state due to his occupation as a nurse. He also had served in the United States Navy, earning medals while serving in the Vietnam War. Harold Gullberg, 66, was a Swedish-American immigrant who was discovered on June 4, 1975, in a decomposed state about 2 weeks after his death in Lincoln Park. He remained slightly inconsistent with the other homicides because he was far older than the others, his underwear had been taken by his killer and his pants were unzipped. However, Gullberg is believed to have been the final confirmed victim of the Doodler. While he remained unidentified, he was known as John Doe No. 81. Police questioned a young man as a murder suspect in the case but could not proceed with criminal charges because the 3 surviving victims did not want to out themselves by testifying against him in court. Among the stabbing survivors were a well-known entertainer and a diplomat. The suspect cooperated with police during his interview, but he never admitted guilt for the murders and attacks. Officers stated that they strongly believed that the man in question was responsible for the crimes, but he was never tried or convicted because of the survivors' refusals to appear in court. To date, the suspect has not been named publicly or apprehended. Very little information is available to the public about the crimes. The case is open and ongoing in the San Francisco Police Department. Recent successes using DNA technology developed in the decades since the crimes have led police to re-examine evidence in the case. In February 2019, police offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of the killer and released a revised sketch showing what he could look like 4 decades later. They later announced they would consider forensic genetic genealogy, which identified a suspect in the Golden State Killer murders. Meet the Monster of Udine. A faceless terror haunting Italy's shadowed streets, whose precise, chilling marks remain unsolved. Step into the dark. The Monster of Udine is a black and mysterious story that accompanied the Friulian area between the beginning of the 70s and the end of the 80s. It all began in September 1971, when 35-year-old Irene Belletti was found lifeless near the Udine station, killed with 7 stab wounds. The investigations are starting, but it will not be possible to trace a culprit. Apparently this is an isolated episode, but in the following years numerous murders follow one another in the Friulian territory. All the victims are women. Most of them were prostitutes. The cause of death is in many cases stabbing, in others strangulation. However, initially not everyone sees the murders connected to each other, thinking they may be unrelated cases rather than the work of a serial killer. The hypothesis of the serial killer begins to take hold after the discovery of Marina Lepper, the one who will be the last victim of the series, consisting of 13 murders. Teacher, 40 years old. On February 26, 1989, his body was found on the bed of the Torrey Stream. Stabbed to death. An incision was made on her belly with a sharp cutting weapon, which starts from the abdomen and reaches the pubis, avoiding the navel, thus forming a sort of S. The medico-legal expertise was entrusted to Dr. Carlo Morisci, who also examined the crimes of Carla Belloni, Luana Giamprocaro, and Aurelia Januszkiewicz. Also on these victims there is the S-shaped cut, as on the body of Marina Lepper. The conclusion is that these 4 crimes are all the work of the same hand. In the meantime, a disturbing testimony emerges. On the same night of Marina Lepper's murder, a few hours after the discovery of the body, 2 carabinieri are at the scene of the murder to carry out an inspection. As they inspect the area, they hear moans. So they decide to approach the area from which the noises seem to come, finding themselves in front of a distressing scene, a man, apparently about 60 years old, who begs forgiveness in front of the entrance of a church, with his arms outstretched to the sky. The carabinieri approach him and ask him for his documents, discovering that he is a doctor specializing in gynecology. They decide to take him home, to the house where he lives with his brother. Arriving on the spot, it will be his brother who denies access to the carabinieri, as he has no search warrant. The episode therefore remains pending, as well as the suspicions about the strange subject seen that night. The investigations are not further developed, and the 13 victims remain without a culprit. In 1996 the investigations were reopened, and focused precisely on the figure of the suspect intercepted on the night of the last murder. It turns out that in reality the doctor has never been able to practice the profession, as he suffers from mental disorders. His home is searched, but no elements are found that can prove his guilt. The subject in question died in December 2006, and the investigation against him was closed. There are many questions about the case. Are the murders all the work of the same hand, or are they to be attributed to two different subjects? And the individual being targeted by the carabinieri? Was he unrelated to the matter, or did he have something to do with the killings? The investigations were reopened in 2019, during the filming of the documentary series Il Mostro di Udine, aired on Crime Plus Investigation. As our final chapter tonight, we delve into the lingering dread of New Orleans' most infamous specter. In a city where smoky jazz clubs sheltered desperate souls and every midnight held the promise of horror, a faceless killer emerged, the Axeman. His brutal, chant-like letter demanded that the city play its melancholy tunes, a ritual meant to stave off a fate all too grisly. Though the music momentarily saved lives that night, the ghost of the Axeman still haunts history, his true identity forever lost in the shadows of unsolved terror. Tonight, as we close this dark episode, his legend reminds us that sometimes, evil remains at large, echoing in every unanswered note and every silent street corner. This is The Axeman of New Orleans. By August of 1918, the city of New Orleans was paralyzed by fear. In the dead of the night, the Axeman of New Orleans, as he came to be known, broke into a series of Italian groceries, attacking the grocers and their families. Some he left wounded, 4 people he left dead. The attacks were vicious. Joseph Maggio, for example, had his skull fractured with his own axe and his throat cut with a razor. His wife, Catherine, also had her throat cut. She asphyxiated on her own blood as she bled out. Several lethal attacks that didn't target Italians were also thought to be the work of the Axeman, although this would later prove not to be the case. Nevertheless, New Orleanians were terrified. The press noted that the Italian immigrant community was especially fearful, with panic-stricken men staying up all night to guard their families. New Orleans Superintendent of Police Frank Mooney suspected that the murderer was a murderous degenerate, who gloats over blood. The Axeman struck households in New Orleans from 1917 to March 1919. Then the killer crossed the Mississippi River to the neighboring town of Gretna. On the night of March 9, he assaulted Charlie Cortimiglia in the familiar fashion, badly injuring Charlie and his wife, Rosie, and killing their 2-year-old daughter. Mooney believed this was the work of their degenerate. The Gretna authorities, Police Chief Peter Lezin and Sheriff Louis Marrero, however, settled on the Cortimiglia's next-door neighbors, elderly Irlando Giordano and his 17-year-old son Frank, as the culprits. As grocers, they were business competitors of the Cortimiglias and had recently taken them to court over a business dispute. The trouble was that no evidence implicated the Giordanos. The officials handled this inconvenience by haranguing the injured Cortimiglias as they lay in Charity Hospital, asking repeatedly, "Who hit you? Was it the Giordanos? Frank did it, didn't he?" According to the doctor who treated her, Rosie always said that she didn't know who had attacked her. When she was well enough to be released, Marrero immediately arrested Rosie as a material witness and incarcerated her in the Gretna jail. She was released only after she signed an affidavit implicating her neighbors. When Irlando and Frank went on trial for their lives, the only evidence against them was Rosie's identification, an identification that even her own physician thought unreliable. Yet, after a trial of less than a week, they were both convicted of murder. 69-year-old Irlando was sentenced to life imprisonment, Frank was to hang. 9 months later, Rosie walked into the newspaper office of the Times-Picayune and retracted her testimony. She said that Saint Joseph had come to her in a dream, and told her she had to tell the truth. Rosie signed another affidavit, this time declaring that she hadn't seen her attackers and had been pressured into identifying the Giordanos. Despite Rosie's retraction, the prosecution didn't immediately give up. At one point, Rosie was threatened with perjury charges if she didn't stick to her original story. But finally, in December 1920, Irlando and Frank walked free. Why were the Gretna authorities so quick to assume that neighbors, against whom there was no evidence, must have been the killers? Why were they so willing to ignore the advice of the New Orleans police chief, who had come to believe that there was a bloodthirsty fiend targeting Italian grocers. The Crescent City had known Italians from its earliest days, and an Italian business community established itself in the city well before the Civil War. These early arrivals hailed mostly from northern Italy, but it was the need for a cheap workforce in the late 19th century that led to the great influx of Sicilians into the state and the city and enticed men like Irlando Giordano, Americanized from Gagliardo, to make the journey from Sicily to Louisiana. Sicilian laborers delighted the sugar planters of post-emancipation Louisiana who found them, as one planter wrote, a hard-working, money-saving race, and content with few of the comforts of life. By the 1880s and 1890s, Sicilians flooded into the port of New Orleans and dominated Italian immigration into Louisiana. Over 80% of the Italian immigrants who arrived in New Orleans were Sicilian. Some stayed. By 1900, the city had the largest Italian community in the South. About 20,000, counting the children of immigrants, lived in New Orleans. But most left to labor on the sugar cane and cotton plantations, an arduous life that nevertheless gave them the chance to save money. An immigrant who carefully hoarded his wages could strike out on his own within a few years. As far as the planters were concerned, this was the one problem with Italian workers. Planters grumbled that they couldn't keep Italians in the field because in a couple of years they would have laid by a little money and are ready to start a fruit shop or grocery store at some crossroads town. By 1900, small Italian-owned businesses had sprung up all over Louisiana. But the commercial success of Sicilian immigrants couldn't protect them from the racial prejudices of the American South. Italians never entirely replaced black labor in Louisiana but worked alongside African Americans in the fields. While Italians, not understanding the racial hierarchies of the South, found nothing shameful about this, for native whites their willingness to do so made them no better than Negroes, Chinese, or other non-white groups. The swarthy Sicilians were often considered not white at all, nothing but black Dagoes. It wasn't lost on a contemporary observer that even African American laborers distinguished between whites and Italians and treated their fellow workers with, as one he described it, a sometimes contemptuous, sometimes friendly, first-name familiarity they would never have dared employ with other whites. The notion that Dagoes were no better than Negroes helps account for growing prejudice against Italian immigrants in the 1870s and 1880s. They faced suspicion and the occasional lynch mob. In 1929, a New Orleans judge expressed a common view of most Sicilians in New Orleans as, of a thoroughly undesirable character, being largely composed of the most vicious, ignorant, degraded and filthy paupers, with something more than an admixture of the criminal element. In New Orleans, the French Quarter, the oldest section of the city filled with decrepit Creole townhouses, had become the Italian neighborhood. By the early 20th century, so many Sicilians congregated in the lower French Quarter near the river that the area from Jackson Square to Esplanade Avenue, between Decatur and Chartres, was known as Little Palermo. One of the most common upward trajectories for an ambitious Sicilian in New Orleans and elsewhere was that from plantation worker to truck farmer and peddler to grocer. By the early 20th century, Italians were taking over the corner grocery business. They owned only 7% of grocery stores in New Orleans in 1880. By 1900, 19% were Italian-owned, and by 1920 they ran fully half of all groceries in the city. Some Italians did very well indeed in New Orleans. After laboring on the sugar cane plantations, Joseph Vaccaro peddled fruit from a mule-drawn cart. He later used a fruit stall in the New Orleans French market to launch his wholesale business and eventually made his fortune importing oranges and bananas. Giuseppe Udo began his career hawking olive oil and cheese from a horse-drawn cart before founding Progresso Food Products. Despite such successes, unpleasant stereotypes clung to Italian immigrants, some of which had a basis in reality. The Sicilians brought with them to America a clannishness and distrust of the authorities that led them to settle their disputes the old-fashioned way, the vendetta. This system of justice survived in Sicily into the 20th century. Immigrants brought it with them to New Orleans, and vendettas, both personal and professional, weren't particularly uncommon. So many shootings and knife fights occurred along Decatur Street that it was nicknamed Vendetta Alley. The fear of immigrant crime culminated in 1890 to 1891 with the murder of New Orleans Chief of Police David Hennessy. The popular official was met with a volley of shotgun fire as he arrived home on the night of October 15, 1890. Mortally wounded, Hennessy insisted, "The Dagos got me." He'd previously been involved in a violent dispute between two Italian factions, the Provenzanos and the Matrangas. New Orleanians found it easy to believe that Hennessy's murder was connected to the feud and that organized Italian criminal gangs the press often referred to as the Mafia were responsible. The police arrested a number of Sicilians, who were to be tried in two groups. After an initial set of acquittals, a mob stormed the jail, murdering 11 of the accused. They lynched some who'd been acquitted, as well as some who had yet to be tried. Criminal Italian gangs were certainly active in New Orleans, although as crime historian Humbert S. Nelly has pointed out, their criminal activity could not accurately be ascribed to mafiosi. Historian Robert M. Lombardo has explained that, the Mafia was not a secret criminal organization but a form of social organization that developed in Sicily and the south of Italy under very specific circumstances. It was, he notes, a form of behavior and a kind of power, not a formal organization. On the other hand, a type of petty extortion known as black hand crime, a practice rather than an organization, did exist in which the victim was threatened with violence if the money demanded wasn't paid. Such crime was ubiquitous in southern Italian communities all over the U.S. by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, including New Orleans, and only disappeared when the descendants of immigrants became sufficiently Americanized to complain to the police. Citizens of New Orleans tended to conflate the vendetta, the mafia, and the black hand, by the early 20th centuries using mafia and black hand interchangeably, using both to refer to a formal criminal organization. Given this history, it wasn't entirely surprising when New Orleanians suspected that the attacks on Italian grocers might be connected to a vendetta or black hand blackmail attempts. However, New Orleans detective John D'Antonio, a nationally known expert on the mafia, rejected the idea, saying that a black hand attack wouldn't have left any survivors as the Axeman frequently did. He agreed with Frank Mooney, New Orleans police superintendent, who was convinced that the attacks were the work of a fiend, a Jekyll and Hyde personality, like Jack the Ripper. Suddenly the impulse to kill comes upon him and he must obey it. In other words, what we'd now call a serial killer. Despite Mooney and D'Antonio's view, when the Axeman attacked the Cortimiglias, the Gretna authorities could more easily accept a vendetta between two Italian businesses than they could the idea that a bloodthirsty fiend stalked the streets. Even some New Orleans police officers still believed that the vendetta could explain the Axeman murders. The Gretna officials had also had enough exposure to the old world traditions of the Sicilian immigrants to have few qualms about manufacturing evidence against their obvious suspects. For this abuse of power no excuse exists. But for their ignorance of serial killers, at the time a novel concept, they cannot be blamed. And suspecting an Italian vendetta wasn't entirely unreasonable in a period when disputes among Italian immigrants not infrequently resulted in assault or murder. A close examination of the attacks attributed to the Axeman shows that not all of these assaults were actually his handiwork. But someone was specifically targeting Italian grocers, both in 1917 to 1919, and in 1910 to 1911 when a similar spate of attacks occurred. According to eyewitness accounts of survivors, the Axeman was a white working-class male in his 30s when the attacks began. From the ease with which he broke into the groceries and his use of a railroad shoe pin, a common burglary tool, the police concluded that he was an experienced burglar. The Axeman vanished from New Orleans after the attack on the Cortimiglias. The murder of Mike Pepitone in August 1919, while sometimes attributed to the Axeman, actually appears to have been part of a long-standing vendetta. Evidence from police records and newspaper accounts, however, show that he struck elsewhere in Louisiana, killing Joseph Spiro and his daughter in Alexandria in December 1920, Giovanni Orlando in Derrida in January 1921, and Frank Scalisi in Lake Charles in April 1921. The killer's modus operandus was the same, breaking into an Italian grocery in the middle of the night and attacking the grocer and his family with their own axe. The Axeman then disappeared from history. Tonight, we journeyed into the darkest corners of our collective nightmares. We encountered the Bunny Man, an urban specter whose violent apparitions still haunt abandoned bridges, the Doodler, a cryptic artist of terror whose macabre sketches remain unsolved, the Monster of Udine, a faceless horror lurking in the recesses of whispered legends, and the Axeman of New Orleans, whose brutal legacy continues to rustle through the alleys and jazz-soaked nights. Each tale left a trail of cold uncertainty, unresolved identities, and an ever-present sense of psychological dread. Their elusive shadows remind us that the unknown is always closer than we dare believe, a flicker in the dark, a breath behind us. The night lingers, and so do they.
And so, our descent comes to a pause. But remember, the crypt holds secrets yet unspoken, a forgotten chronicle awaits, one that will twist our understanding of history even further. I am the Decay Echo, and until our next journey, let the whispers of the past guide you deeper into the shadows.